I'm Ewa Messer. I'm the producer and host of Poured Over, and Claire Dederer and I have been trying to do this interview for more than a minute. Monsters has been out in paperback now, and schedules and life and stuff, and I am so happy we get to have this conversation because when this book came out in hardcover, Claire, you got me thinking about the nature of criticism and the role of criticism and the role of critics and this idea that we pretend that criticism is somehow objective all the time. And it's not. It's not. It's so subjective. I don't care who you are or what the masthead says or what, the byline. It's not. So can we just start with criticism before we get into Monsters, A Fan's Dilemma?
Yeah, thank you. Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy we were able to pull this off. It has been many months. So when I started thinking about the book, or really the question, when I really started exploring the question, it kind of, the simplest way to think about it is balancing the greatness of the work against sort of the rottenness of the behavior, right? So there's this sort of sense that you have these scales you're weighing. And of course, when we talk about this stuff, we really focus a lot on the bad behavior. And that's sort of that pointing finger is sort of where a lot of the energy goes. But what is happening on the other side of the scale? What is it that's going on when we talk about the greatness of the work? And it wasn't, I was writing on this for quite some time before I realized I needed to kind of dismantle what that meant and really think about what was going on there. There was this kind of aura of authority around the idea of greatness that somehow we can all agree that the work is important. And like, who is we? What is important? What's going on there? And I became really interested in who is the speaking voice that says the work's great and who gets to decide. And there are several other writers I read that really helped to guide me toward this point where I started to address the idea of the subjectivity of the critic in terms of what's determining what's great. That's a start to answer your question.
Yeah.
My thinking goes on from there.
But you also are pulling in two other pieces that don't necessarily get addressed at the same time when we're talking about criticism, right? Fandom, which in the world we live in, fandoms have always existed, but there's a velocity now to them. Mm-hmm. And rigidity isn't quite the word I want, but there's a seriousness to them. Even when it's sort of a joyful kind of fandom, there's an intensity there that I feel is sort of new.
Yeah, that's interesting. I've never thought about that word, that idea of rigidity. I almost wonder if there's a kind of brittleness or there's sort of a quality that this thing can be broken, but it's going to be kept as absolute right until the moment it gets broken.
Well, it's also partially something I've been thinking about based on something you said in the book, where you were talking about how we have used our love of art, whatever the piece of art is, whether it's music, painting, books, film, whatever that piece of art is, almost as a way to define ourselves, right? And sometimes it's moral, sometimes it's identity, sometimes, we hold on to representation a little more tightly than perhaps we may have in the past. And you and I are roughly the same age. So we were raised by wolves a bit in the 70s and 80s, but it's kind of fascinating to me, that piece of it. And then you bring in your own sort of approach and you're wrestling with all of this stuff on the page in full view of all of us who are reading. And not every critic is willing to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I can't really talk any longer about the stuff we're talking about without bringing up Pearl Clegg, who was really crucial to the writing of this book. So I was working on it. I was reading a lot on this problem of what happens when we consume art, this problem of fandom, this problem of separating the art from the artist, which is so facile. But anyway, and then I stumbled, and none of it was sort of helping. And then I stumbled upon this essay called Mad at Miles by the writer Pearl Clegg, which I really was a real structural problem in the book because I saved it for the end so that it would have its weight, but it really determined the thinking throughout the book. And in that piece, so the piece is called Mad at Miles. So her emotionalness, her kind of emotion and her identity is right up front. You're getting to know her right in the title. She is Madame Miles Davis. And she writes about this falling in love with Miles Davis, having not just falling in love with the music, but also becoming, in the way you're talking about, that kind of fan way, her own identity becoming intertwined with his. So like, getting ready, she breaks up with I think her husband or her partner, and she's getting ready to go on dates and she's listening to Miles. And we all know how music works in that moment, right? When it's weaving into certain eras of your life. I'm nervous to use the word eras anymore, but anyway. And she talks about the way it becomes collapsed to all these different, with all these different previous selves of her own. And then she finds out that he was an abuser, and she comes up against this problem of, she's a survivor. She's a Black woman. These are the women he hurt. So there's this really intense personal pain. There's also her desire to not speak out against a Black man. There's a lot of stuff from her own identity shaping this response. And when I read that, obviously people, Jess Hopper is an example of a rock writer who writes brilliantly from a personal point of view. There's a lot of people who do this kind of writing. Something about the way Clegg wove identity, and it was the meeting of Miles's biography and her biography. It was about those two things coming together with this equal value and this idea that we both have histories, the audience member and the artist. And that, for me, opened up the idea. You spoke earlier about the idea of love, the work we love. And I think it's worth pausing there, because I think that's the core of the issue, is we kind of fall back on the idea of greatness or genius or an objective concept of what makes the work important. But what's really going on is we love the work. If we didn't love the work, it wouldn't be hard. You wouldn't have to write an essay called Madame Miles or a book about it. So this kind of emotional quality became much more interesting to me, and an emotional quality. And I've been a critic my whole life. It's not as if I'm coming to this like, oh, critics should all just lighten up and talk about their feelings. Like, I've started as a critic. So this is background I speak from. I think that driving toward this idea of individual subjectivity became then really important. And I think that we often talk about subjective criticisms when they come from othered identities.
Yeah.
So you think about like the writer Greg Tate writing about rap, or people like that where they are giving voice to what we think of as an identity group. But of course, there's an identity group at the center of this whole conversation. And I hate to use this phrase because it's so banal sounding, but white men have shaped what we call great for so long with no understanding of their own subjectivity or their own identity. That is an identity that never gets identified as such, because there's this perfect flow from artist to critic to audience where we all have the same identity. We always have, so we never have to think about it. The book is really thinking about how can those kinds of writers, or me as a white woman, all these different people, think with more acuity about their own identity. Right? That's what I'm asking for in my writing on criticism.
Which I spend a lot of time in archives for major newspapers and magazines. Just when you're prepping for something like this, you spend a lot of time digging around, looking for through lines, and it's wild. The way criticism has changed and the way it's been presented, who gets reviewed, how they get reviewed, the words that are used. Semantics. Wow. Some of it is an absolute trip, and you kind of have to take it with a grain of salt.
Please say a lot more about that.
Well, I'm just thinking of, an old review of Edwige Dandicott, right? Where I was just like, oh, this is the person that they chose to review the book was trying to connect with it, but had some feel. And I was like, but she's on the forefront of Haitian literature, Haitian American literature, right? It is a classic coming of age story, but you kind of need to be able to connect with the fact that she's also, I think Edwige was 25 when Breath, Eyes, Memory was published. Yeah. And it's the early 90s, and, the early 90s, we were barbarians. We were just total barbarians. We were.
Yeah.
And I mean, it wasn't a dismissive review. It was just clunky. And there are times where I've been a bookseller for a really long time. And there are times where I read reviews by someone whose byline I know quite well. And I feel like, I know you fell in love with that sentence, but that's not enough to build a review around. And that feels weirdly personal. Like there's backstory here that and I'm using books obviously as the main example because that's what I know best. Also, I have terrible taste in movies. Like I've seen Speed more times than I can count.
Oh, I'm a big fan.
Fast and the Furious, all of it. If I'm watching something on the screen, I need ridiculous. Like that's
right.
It means
that's what the screen is for.
Yeah, I can't. I've tried. I like it when ridiculous things like buses get jumped on highways and things like that. But there's an intimacy to reading, and there's a presumption of connection that happens. And also, a reader is always going to bring their own experience to whatever the text is.
Right.
And this question of authority, right? Like, who gets to decide? Who's the gatekeeper? What does canon look like? And this is something that's sort of tweaked me for a very long time, is like the evolution of canon or the lack of evolution in canon. And it's like, well, what's missing from the conversation?
And even the rubrics that we use for, say we're talking about expand, even the concept of expanding the canon is a very like difficult idea or complicated idea. Yeah. But when we talk about expanding, we tend to sort of rely on, first of all, authoritative statements like good or great.
Yeah.
And we also tend to rely on ideas that I think have some quality of authority built into them, which is the idea of transcendence or universality.
Right.
And I mean, I don't write about this in the book, but it's something that I had to grow into thinking about as I expanded my own personal canon and read, more and more writing that was not super intimate to my own experience. And this idea of universality or transcendence can be incredibly coercive, right? Like maybe the job of the job of the novelist is to take you into their experience. And maybe that goes deeply into this idea of humbling yourself before the work. Like you just need to allow that person to take you where they're going. And if you're constantly calling for universality, what exactly are you doing?
So universality for me comes in the details of someone else's life. And I get surprised where I'm like, wait, what? I mean, I grew up as a half Asian kid in the suburbs of Massachusetts in a moment where literally I was the only brown face. If my brother or my mom wasn't in the room, it was me. I'm like, hi. So, being able to pick up a book, so Laura Ingalls Wilder was my first sort of touch point. And again, problematic, right? Like, what do you know when you're 8? And now you look back and you're like, but I really did want a sod house in my backyard and my parents wouldn't let me dig one.
Right.
They were convinced that the roof would collapse on my head or possibly what the neighbors would think. But you look back on it and you're like, oh.
Right. That's really interesting. The universality in a book like that. I'm really interested in this idea that the universality doesn't reside in some shared kind of lofty human emotion, but lies in the accruing of specific details that allows the reader to escape into a different world. So it's almost like what you're saying is the form of the writing is what makes it universal, this putting together of details rather than some kind of message like we're all the same. And I mean, honestly, aside from the deeply problematic nature of Little House on the Prairie, there's nobody better at resting in her own details. She spends a chapter describing building a fish trap. And there's these moments that are so, I mean, we all have that moment. Any Little House person has that moment engraved in their memory where there's the snow and then they pour the maple syrup in the snow and make it, so it's that detail, right? As opposed to something she's saying. And how do we allow ourselves to be open to all different kinds of detail that's accrued in that? Yeah.
And that's, I mean, I want in some ways to be transported, but I'm not necessarily the first person who's reaching for, say, science fiction or fantasy, right? Like, I don't even know if it's comfort zone. It's just, I reach for a certain kind of book first. I need beautiful sentences. I need voice. I need maybe complicated, messy people that I don't necessarily like.
Yeah. Yeah. This all sounds like me.
Right. Yeah. But I just, and sometimes I need 500 pages and sometimes I need something wildly short. But if the language and the voice isn't there, I'm in for as long as I need to be in. And certainly I have read a lot of stuff where I've been like, I totally understand exactly who this book is for. And I am happy to connect you with, like, we've all done it. Right. But if it's just me reading for me, or when I think of the writers who've influenced sort of how I approach the interviews that I do, it's all of a larger piece. I mean, you started out as a film critic, you moved to books. I mean, I remember reading your byline for just about forever because I was a baby publicist. It felt like at that point too, like, sort of mid 90s, late 90s, early aughts, alt weeklies were having a really brilliant moment. And like, we could actually do things by sliding, like I could take a mid-list title and slide it to someone in an alt weekly and we could make a local bestseller. Like we could change someone's trajectory with like the right tiny review in a not necessarily mainstream, but not entirely off the rails kind of thing. I mean, we did some good work.
Yeah. But I mean, I have, you said many things, so I'm like running back over everything you said. I'm really interested in this idea of what you're looking for I want to get back to the alt week and the criticism idea, but this idea of what you're looking for in work. I mean, what you're describing in some ways is realism. That's what and for me, that's very much, it's very hard for me to go into fantasy and science fiction. And I always think of it as, I want to stay in the wardrobe, in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. I'm like, tell me more about the wardrobe. Let's hang out in the house for a while. And so any science fiction or fantasy I enter has to have that realism as the entry point. So I really relate to that. I'm just enumerating everything you just said. But also, I think it's really interesting for critics. I mean, this is maybe just a conversation about what it is to be a critic, but I think that when you're reading for a review and the book isn't for you, or you're reading as a bookseller and the book isn't for you, and you can see who the book is for, and then you have to ask, well, if this book were for me, would it be good? I feel like that is, I've done a lot of that. I've reviewed for a long time. I think it's been incredibly good for my own development as a reader and thinker.
Yeah, totally.
I don't think many people get pushed into that position. And I think it's a place where critics can actually, or booksellers, can become more fluid and kind of omnivorous readers in a way that benefits our own thinking and selfhood. So I love that part of my job, where I really have to subsume my taste a little bit, even though we've been talking all along about subjectivity and preference.
But to have the context, right?
Yes.
So I know my subjectivity is some context. I know my experience as a reader is some context. I know the writer's experience in their biography is some of the context.
Yeah.
Right? Like our society is changing at a pace that I'm not entirely sure all of us were prepared for. Even if you think about the change in language, right? In the last 3-4 years, we've done some cool stuff with language. Right. And why is the change of language so angrifying? Why that particular thing? Right. Well, why is it pronouns that we have to talk about? Or, there's a bunch of other incredible language things that happen. But what is it? What is people's connection or rage around language? It's fascinating. And it's context. All of it is context to me. And I mean, the way I engage with art, you've had me really thinking for months and months and months about stuff. But so I was at LACMA a couple of months ago in Los Angeles, and there's an entire room of Picassos. And there's this new to me statue. It's a bronze of a giant rooster, and it's called the Cock. And the note written by the curator was just like, well, you should know this stuff about Picasso. Right. And as someone who grew up, and I've always been very fortunate, and I've been able to go to museums in lots of different places, and I'm used to these very sort of staid, formal
Right. Picasso, this place.
Yeah, exactly. And this was kind of like, yeah, this guy was a jerk. And by the way, this woman was like, he made the statue for his neighbor down the street who was having an affair. But it was a whole sort of breathy, fun. It was a fun take on this. And I was like, oh, I would like to meet the person who wrote this.
Interesting. So that subjectivity sort of coming out in the placard.
I think if you've never experienced Picasso, I mean, the first time I saw Mademoiselle d'Avignon in real life, I was like, oh, that's why people talk about this painting the way they talk about this painting. Mm-hmm. I'd only ever seen reproductions in textbooks, and that painting does not reproduce well on the page.
Yeah, that's correct.
And then you see it in real life, and you're like, that? Okay. But he's still Picasso.
Right. I mean, obviously the Picasso thing has been central to this book. I write a lot about him. And I've thought a lot about my experience of Picasso within the context of the museum, and what happens inside the museum when his biography is acknowledged and what happens when it's not acknowledged. And, a lot of there's this whole gig of people having Picasso shows, and then I go there and give context now, which is fascinating to me. Like there's this sort of idea that we're going to kind of solve Picasso by having me come and say we can't solve Picasso. What I think about a lot, and the most helpful moment for me over the last year, was when I was in Chicago on book tour, and somebody somehow organized a visit for me at the Chicago Institute of Art, and I was meeting with undergraduate painting students. So they were studio students. They were not history students. And it was just, I think about it all the time. I went and these kids were talking about this issue, and they had a completely different relationship to this problem because they need the painting, right? So they need to go across the street to the Art Institute Museum and look at the Gauguins. And they want to look at the paintings, but they also want to be given context, right? The context then gives them the ability to not feel like they're dupes, right? The work. There's a way that giving the context allows all of us a little bit more latitude to actually enjoy the work, because we're not sort of wondering if we're going to acknowledge the problem, right? Like I saw we don't have to get into this, but I saw a beautiful example of this at Mopop here in Seattle, where they're collecting pop culture detritus and ephemera, and they have all this Harry Potter stuff, and they just, without doing very much, they just acknowledge some of without pointing fingers or calling anybody names, they acknowledge the context around that work now, so that we can all feel more comfortable looking at it. But in particular, trans museum goers, their families can find a way to even engage with these objects in the museum without sort of having their brains go on the fritz.
You have a great line in Monsters, and I'm just going to quote you for a second. The way you consume art doesn't make you a bad person or a good one. You'll have to find some other way to accomplish that. Yeah. And I mean, it makes me think of sort of 15-year-old me who loved REM to all extent, and it's just, when you identify with music and you're like, well, this is my whole identity, like WFNX in Boston, and like that had just come on the air and we were all so excited. Right, you know exactly what I'm talking about.
Yeah, Michael Stipe with his
all of it. Seriously, my first show in Boston, my first concert ever, was REM at Walter Brown Arena at BU. And he sang mostly with his back to the crowd because I think he was totally freaked out by it. Who are these children? What is going on?
Incredible.
But that sense of identity that came along, I couldn't find Athens, Georgia on a map. Are you kidding me? My records were all either on vinyl or audio tape.
Right. No. This idea,
all of that kind of stuff. But it was, there were the kids who wanted hair metal. There were the kids who were Aerosmith kids. That was sort of the first differentiation I remember in sort of junior high school, was like you picked a camp of music and it represented everything. Well, I mean,
I do have to pause to make a plug, which is that my partner has a book about REM coming out.
I have the galley. I promise you, I have the galley, and I'm saving it because
it's coming out on election day. So, he needs all the
I will put the title in the show notes, but there's a separate conversation for you and I have once we finish taping.
Yeah. It's but it was anyway. Yeah, I was that kid as well. I grew up very much in that world, and I think that this is something that We're kind of used to Nick Hornby being great now. He's just been great for so long that it's a accepted fact. But what he did in High Fidelity in the novel, identifying this idea that you are what you like. Yeah. That's what the book is kind of centered around. And the film deals with it really, the first film deals with it really well. That what you like makes you better. What you like makes you who you are. What you like gives you your identity. And of course, the struggle in that book is that turns out not to be true. And this person has to, he has to love a person who loves Kate Bush, who he hates. I mean, that's a plot point in this extremely good, silly.
I remember because I did love Kate Bush.
Me too, and I still do. But
yeah, same.
The courage to take that problem and write a novel about it is it's incredible to reflect on, because nobody really was. I mean, it's still something that doesn't get talked about in quite the way he did in that book. And I love the way he pushes back past that idea. And what you like is very, very important. What you like is crucial to who you are, especially when you're young. But it's not everything, and it doesn't make you a good person. And this is something that I'm fascinated by. This is something I'm continuing to write on and explore. This kind of sense of virtue that comes with connecting with certain kinds of art. But are you really doing anything? That's a question.
Well, and I love asking that question, because when I think back on it, 18-year-old me loved Henry Miller. And I was grocery shopping with my dad one night going on about Tropic of Cancer. And he just looked at me with a very straight face and said, "But when I was your age, we read it for the dirty bits." I was like, well, I just got put in my place by my old man. But now, I mean, I did try to reread it as an adult human, and doesn't quite sing for me the same way it did when I was 18.
Yeah,
it does not. I was like, ooh, right. Okay, we're good. Thanks.
Well, and it's not that I'm saying that I don't value transgressive art, because that's obviously a really crucial thing. It's beyond just, I mean, obviously it's really important to have representation of different people's experience, but there's a value beyond that, just to really there's a value in reading difficult texts, as Judith Butler would say. There's a value in engaging with experimental forms. It's the kind of moral charge that comes with choosing whether or not you're going to consume this art made by supposedly bad people. I'm not sure is a valuable place for us to stop very long, because there's a lot of other stuff that needs to get done. And, I realize I just spent a whole book kind of residing in this question, but I did come out the other side saying it's like, is there ethical consumption? It's to say, your love of the work is also really important. Okay, all of that. Now go find a different way to be a good person.
But not only all of that, go find a good way to be a good person, but also that your relationship to art can change.
Yes.
And that it can evolve with time. And that's partially circumstance, it's partially you, there's so many pieces that go, it's not.
Right. It goes back to that.
I would hope that our relationship with art would be, whatever that art form is, that it would be fluid, that it would be mutable, that we would be in a position where we could say, well, this sings to me, but it didn't, and now it does. That conversation between art and whoever we are in that moment.
Right. And the minute you kind of assert that idea, you undercut the concept of authority, which has, what you're talking about is the self, the ship of Theseus of the self, the self changing constantly over time, and the ingredient of time in this dynamic, and then the ingredient of time in the critical self, right? And so everything you just said is, you just made the most powerful argument against authority, because even the authority himself will change. And we see that beautifully in Pearl Clegg, who wrote, or talked in an interview decades maybe after she wrote Man at Miles, like, I listened to him again, right?
And I remember having my brain blown when I'd heard that she'd started, I was like, wait.
What?
Yes, it was a giant what moment. And I was like, I think my brain had a cramp. Right, I don't want to say it broke, but it definitely cramped. I was like, oh, wait a minute. And if you can come back to something, I mean, it kind of comes back to choice, right? What do you choose to do? How do you choose to interact? How do you choose to take a piece of information, some of which is gruesome? I mean, I'll be perfectly, I saw Alice a million years ago in the movie theater, and I thought, Alan doesn't like women. I'm not okay with this, and I don't understand why Mia Farrow made this movie with him.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really astute point.
You know, and then I was like, I'm good, and I haven't seen one. But yes, have I seen the early stuff? Yes, VHS was a thing. We watched a lot of movies on VHS for a very long time. But now I'm kind of like, yeah, I'm good, thanks.
Well, right. Or the self that, the self when I was young that thought I was supposed to like Manhattan, right? That was what you did because authority called it a masterpiece. It was more important to me to be part of that club of appreciating cinema and appreciating what is great. It was more important to me to identify with that than it was important to me to have my own response or listen to my own response, which is a little corny, but to reside in my own feelings about the film. And then you watch it, I wrote extensively about watching it later, and there's a million different ways that it makes me uncomfortable. But one of them, and the most interesting one, sort of in terms of what you're saying, is how much he dislikes Diane Keaton in the film.
Right?
Like the thinking woman is brittle, is broken, is everything you don't want to be around. And you can also see his character's kind of attraction to her strength, but his pulling away from it. And there's all this ambivalence that is upsetting.
Yeah. I'm wondering who your first art monster was. Like, who was the person that, I mean, yeah, I'm talking about Laura Ingalls Wilder, but I don't think she was technically my first. But, like, who was the first person that sort of broke your, I don't want to say heart necessarily, but broke your brain a little bit, where you were like, oh, hi, how am I processing this?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like because this is hard to talk about, but because I came up really in punk and in alternative music, there was just a constant flow of those people, and it was so normalized. And there was a long chapter about rock and about punk and alternative music in the book that we took out because it's just so banal. And, I didn't really have new thoughts about it because all the thoughts have been said. But Jess Hopper, again, not to keep harping on Hopper, but Hopper talks about this idea of being when you listen and you consume music, you're identifying with the singer. Mm-hmm. And so often as someone who was really, really into music when I was young, I was identifying with someone saying something awful about me, right? Like that was so built in. The sexism was so built into every song. And I thought about this a lot when Tom Petty died. He had empathy for his female characters, right? His women were, he's not someone who was super important to me when I was young, but I was thinking about this particular feeling tone there was around him. And it had to do with the ability to listen to a rock song without being put into a false position.
Right.
Which happens over and over and over. So that was just, like I love Iggy Pop, and that was like a problem there. I mean, it was so much part of not just what I listened to, but the scene I grew up in.
Yeah.
There was this kind of what was alternative and punk, I mean, in general, was like this kind of what we call now an edgelord, like this kind of, I'm going to say the difficult thing, Steve Albini, who we are all eulogizing now, like having, or, sanctifying now, having a band called Rape Man. And what was going on in that band. And, this sort of like that was accepted as part of that culture. So it's something I came up in, and that laugh of, the indelible and the hippocampus laugh is what I grew up in.
Right.
That there was just, this stuff was supposed to be funny. So I almost can't even pull one thing because it was so part of what shaped me and made me, I think it crippled me as not that I'm a victim, but I think it was one of the things that crippled me as a young writer.
No, I can totally see that. The downtown literary scene, which I'm using air quotes as I say. If you're not watching this on YouTube, I am using air quotes on the downtown literary scene. But it was a similar thing. It's like, well, what do you mean you don't find that funny? And it's like, well, yeah, because it's gross.
Yeah.
And we were barbarians. Like the things we didn't know when we were sort of babies coming up through that whole world. It's kind of outrageous if I think I'm like, how did we all survive our 20s?
I know, exactly. But then you think about, Kathleen Hanna and what was being born at the same time. And it's like, wow, I was so entrenched in this internalized misogyny of this scene.
Yeah.
And before we get comments, I will say that many, many people have really talked about how Steve Albini helped them and what an incredible character he was. And that just speaks to the complexity of every single person. And he's talked a lot about that band and what happened in that band. So it's, people change and have different relationships to this stuff as well. So in the book, I talk about Polanski as being the monster who really started me on this path. And I wrote this memoir, Love and Trouble. I started writing it in 2010. So I've been thinking about this stuff. I'm really tired of thinking about it. I've been thinking about it for 14 years. And when I started Love and Trouble, the first thing, it became a memoir about growing up in sexually predatory 1970s and how my experiences of that sort of have these long-term kind of effects, sine wave effects into my own adulthood sexuality. So I was really interested in when something rotten happens to you, how does that shape you and create you as a sexual being? But the book started out, I was going to write a study of Roman Polanski. So it's a little bit like the Jeff Dyer out of sheer rage problem, trying to write his serious study of Lawrence. I was going to write a book about Roman Polanski, and then I was going to write a book about the crime, and then I was going to write a book about her, and then I thought, well, I can't steal her story. And finally, I just had to admit, I have a daughter who's 13. I have my own experiences. This is the story I want to tell. So I did a bunch, and Polanski appears as as someone I think about in that book, not a character. And I researched him a lot for that book, and I talk about this in Monsters. And when I finished, I found like he was still one of my favorite filmmakers. And that just seemed this immovable object in the middle of my experience of film. And so that was sort of what generated the forward movement on the book.
But is forgiveness part of this conversation?
I mean,
I'm not saying you forgave Polanski for what that's not what I mean, but like in an overarching sense of like, are we forgiving ourselves to a certain point for engaging in the art? I don't have any, I'm genuinely asking the question because I don't know. I sort of feel like we throw the word forgiveness around very sort of haphazardly, culturally. Yeah. So it may not even be the word I'm looking for, but I am also thinking a little bit of Ray Carver. I mean, you and I both like Carver quite a lot as a writer. Yeah. And he was I mean, I remember the first time I read a Carver story, I was like, who is this dude? And then you find out later that maybe he was a little heavily edited, whatever.
Right. Well, that's a whole other
That's a whole different story. But I mean, he was revelatory.
Yeah.
And not the best dude.
There's a difference between, to me, okay, first of all, going back to the idea of forgiveness, I really like your idea of do we forgive ourselves?
Right.
And I think that because so much of what this book is dealing with is what is the audience experience? What is the human experience as you engage with this stuff? And I do think that dynamic of forgiving yourself for whatever it is that, for the year I was obsessed with Kanye. I mean, to bring up a name that always, right? It's, I think we have to. I think if you're somebody who's engaging passionately with art, that is going to happen. But in terms of someone like Carver, I mean, I wonder if there's a difference between, Carver would never have pretended that he wasn't that.
Yeah.
That he wasn't everything that he was. He owned the breadth of his own experience.
Yeah.
You wonder what it would be like for a Carver in the moment after 2017, where we have this incredibly convoluted dance around the concept of apology and asking for forgiveness. Right. What would that have looked like in his hands as somebody who really his fallibility was part of why he was making art, was to represent that human fallibility. So, for me, that becomes much less complicated because it's dealt with in the work, right? It's right there. And therefore, because it's dealt with in the work, it makes room for me to confront my own monstrousness.
Are we possibly talking about an authenticity problem? I mean, just listening to what you said now, and do we want people to own their authentic selves? Do we want them to admit, yeah, I'm a creep? And does that somehow give us space? I mean, because there are some artists that I just choose now not to. I'm okay with it because there's always new art, right?
Right.
But I'm not going to say to someone, you can't, because I don't know what they're.
Right. Because of all the reasons we've been talking.
Everyone needs to make their own decision as far as I'm concerned, and I'm certainly not going to try and knock someone off their position. I want us, though, to be asking the questions about why we have the response. There's a ferocity to the response that I would like us to ask more questions about, right? Because we saw it with Me Too, where there was a moment where people were like, well, I just don't believe you. Or it was, we have to believe
the women or the men. Or
the men saying to the women, we don't, it might not even be a gender thing. It's more just there was the, I believe, I don't, it was this schism that was really, it wasn't messy. It was forceful. It was you can't make me. It was almost a really,
like, you can't make me give up the art? Is that what you're talking about?
You can't make me give up the art. You can't make me believe your experience of this art because of my experience of the art. Right.
Right.
There's no meeting in the middle. It's just kind of like, here's my position, here's your position, and then that's.
I think it goes back to your idea at the beginning of this conversation about the brittleness of the fan.
Yeah.
Right. The rigidity, that was the word you used, of the fan. And I think it goes back to this idea that your identity, there's this collapse between fan and performer. Obviously fandom has always existed, but because of structures of social media and the way that we consume work and the way that biography is everywhere and we can't escape it, and because capital makes money off of our fan relationships, and because of all these things, we are more in this position where both there's this rigidity of attachment to the fan, but then there's also this, like, if your person that you love has screwed up, then what's your relationship to that? And I think that tends to sort of drive people into these more hardened perspectives that you're describing.
Also, this passive delivery of biography, right? You say this in multiple points in the book, like, we can't escape people's biography anymore.
Yeah.
Back, there were plenty of things I didn't know about people because the information was just not available. And now we live in a world where the information is absolutely available. And sometimes I'm really glad to have that information. And other times I'm like, oh, I wish I hadn't seen that. And I live in a world where I have that choice. I know that.
Yeah. I mean, I think that it goes back to what you were saying about REM. Mm-hmm. The sort of album would sort of fly to you through outer space, and you know what I mean? And you just get it and you'd be like, oh my God, what's this? I love this cover. I love the way these people look. I guess I'll buy you didn't know. Maybe if you read NME or something, like, it was very hard to get information. And now, of course, you can't escape. And I do, I've thought about this a lot since publishing the book. And I've talked about this before, but right after the book was published, I was in New York. I ran into Carrie Brownstein, and I don't know her. And we bumped into each other and we started talking. It was just like a very strange, magical finding a wild creature in the forest moment. And she was talking about they had just done a show in Philadelphia, and she had like a spare day. And she was walking around New York trying to find art she had never read anything about or heard anything about.
Oh, wow.
And I was just, it really was this incredible moment for me of, right, you can do that. And so I've been reflecting on this a lot as I talk to people, and they're so tormented. And it's like, all of this aside, like, this is all of these feelings you have about the complexity, about yearning for a validation of your fandom or yearning for an apology from this person and to see more authenticity from them, as so few people have demonstrated. All of this reaction to our experience of biography is valid and real and something we're all going through. I think that's why I explored it. But there's also this really, like, we can stop. We can create different, I mean, you can't because it's your job, but we can try to create ways of consuming art that are more private. And a lot of what I think about is both my consumption of social media, but also my posting, my relationship to work when I'm consuming it, or, you know, I go through these phases with people in my family where we will watch the whole filmography of someone, or I might be reading an entire author's entire backlist. How do I wrench myself out of that being a consumable project for the world? And it doesn't have to do with any status I have. It has to do with the status we all have as producers of content. And I would love to have my relationship to art be a lot more private. So that's what I'm working on.
Privacy is a whole different conversation.
Yeah, exactly. But I do think that, like, that escape from biography.
Yeah, I understand exactly what you say. I appreciate the connection that people build out of fandom. I really do. I think there's something to be said when you know that there's someone out in the world who loves a thing the way you love a thing, and you feel less lonely. I do think loneliness is a problem that we need to figure out how to talk about as a society and, like, actually maybe do something about. And especially when I see younger kids who are coming up in fandom in a way that is theirs and not just, like, I've been to Comic-Con a couple of times for various and sundry reasons, and, like, seeing the kids come up, or, like, you know, baby readers turn into adult, like, there's a lot of joy there, but joy doesn't preclude asking questions. Like, I mean, nostalgia is a thing that I would like us as a society to interrogate more. And I think art sometimes flows back into nostalgia. It's like, well, I love this thing so much, and this thing. I'm going to cheat for a second and just say, you know, there are people who have feelings about the original Star Wars movies, which I forget what the new titles are. And there are people who have feelings about, you know, the ones that Lucas made with Ewan McGregor. So, you know, I don't know. It's messy. And that's what I appreciate the most about Monsters, though, because you have not a single easy answer in this book. And I think that's beautiful.
Oh, thank you. I mean, I feel like, yeah, I think that was reading Pearl Clegg and looking at the subjectivity and emotionality of her response. That was what was interesting, was to read that and not think, oh, now I have to think what Pearl Clegg thinks. Right. It was that she modeled a process for me. Right. And so that put this incredible onus on me to be in my own subjectivity in the book, which is quite frightening to do in a book like this.
Right.
You know, it was really, really a scary book to publish in that way, because it would have been so much easier to speak from authority. But I just thought, well, Clegg modeled this for me. I model it for the reader, and then the reader reflects on their own relationship. But as a middle-aged white lady, it's like, who cares what I think? You know, it's that speaking out of my own specific experience was really, really important to make the book do what it was supposed to do. It had to have all that wobbliness and movement and perspective, and it had to have it formally as well. All the things you're talking about are formal elements as well.
Yeah, but you also come out of a moment in criticism where there were not a lot of women. No, there were just not a lot of women writing criticism.
There were not.
And I mean, it's when I think about how much the media landscape has changed in the time since you and I sort of joined the, you know, whatever piece of the media business we're in, it is wild to me how we shifted from not a lot of women to, we had that moment where, you know, women were just doing a lot. And now we're just in a place where the landscape has shrunk to a point where not a lot of people are doing a lot of things. And you have to find a new way. You know, it's fun watching Bookstagrammers, and it's fun watching these kids on TikTok. Their sense of wonder and discovery is a delight. And I love having a plurality of voices.
Me too.
But I still want us asking questions. And I still want us saying, well, where are we trying to go?
Well, also, I think it goes back to this problem of subjectivity and criticism. I'm talking about valorizing and lifting up the subjective point of view, but that doesn't mean that you write a criticism without rigor. And so that's, you know, I love the multiplicity of voices. I love the new books that come to me, and the new voices and new writers, new worlds that come to me through all the things you're describing. And I do really try to be open to that. At the same time, criticism has requirements. that have to do with fairly representing the writer's work. So I think that in a lot of the criticism in these new forms, there's a way in which the writer herself isn't represented in a meaningful way, whether that's through synopsis or quoting or how, context, like you keep talking about.
Right.
All of these different elements that make a useful and rigorous criticism do get lost. And and actually you see it not just in the media that we're talking about, but also like a lot of criticism in newspaper and magazines has started to falter on these fronts as well. It's become normalized to not really engage in a detailed way with the work itself, which I find so frustrating.
I don't need a book report, and I feel like I've been reading a lot of reviews that are essentially summaries.
Yeah.
I'm like, well, where does this fit into the larger thing? Where does this... And
I feel like I'm reading a lot of things where I walk away and I don't understand the nature of the book. I don't understand what the book sounds like. I don't see quotes. I don't get what the author is trying to do. I hear a lot about what the reviewer thinks, and I'm not coming away with the kind of foregrounding of the author that's what I'm interested in.
Right. I just, I think the more people we can bring to the conversation, that's what I'm most interested in. I mean, honestly, I can't tell you the last time I saw a Polanski film. I remember liking Chinatown when I was younger. I remember seeing Rosemary's Baby and thinking, I'm very happy I live downtown. That's how young I was when I saw it. I'm glad we don't have an easy answer. I think that's really what it comes down to for me, is I'm glad we don't have an easy answer. I do think there are people who should think about how they live.
Right.
And I hope they figure their stuff out.
Right. And I think, it goes back to this idea of apology or acknowledgement.
Right.
Like, we're having this conversation and it's over and over, we find ourselves in a vacuum of response from the artists themselves. And so such that when somebody does make a statement, like the guy who made Community, Dan Harmon, I think, that was just incredible because of its rarity. It wasn't like it just, so we're all sort of muddling along and yet we're sort of on our own.
I think it also speaks to the power of intimacy. Again, everyone has their own response to a piece of art. Certainly, I see this with books when I hear people and the way they talk about books and their relationship to characters or the author or what have. It's a really intense experience. It's a really kind of big emotional experience for a lot of folks. And I think when you take that feeling, and this is something you riff on too in Monsters, but if you take feeling out of the equation entirely, we are missing a pretty significant piece of the conversation.
And I really love thinking about that in terms of your role as a bookseller. Mm-hmm. Like, you're engendering feeling, you're connecting with this incredibly intimate experience this person's going to have, and you're at the pinch point for that as a bookseller, which is really an interesting role in terms of emotion.
Some days it's super easy and great, and some days you're just like, okay, I need a cookie and a nap. Oh, I need a cookie and a nap. That's really...
Yeah.
Claire, I think we've gone not as long as I thought we would, but I think we're okay. We could keep going. We could make a mini podcast. We could totally make a mini podcast about this. But on that note, I'm going to say thank you so much, Claire Dederer. Monsters, A Fan's Dilemma is out in paperback, and I'm really glad you put this book out into the world. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a joy to talk to you.
I'm Miwa Messer. I'm the producer and host of Poured Over. And if you hear me laughing, it's because I got to reread The Laughter, which is Sonora Jaw's debut novel. And it was out in hardcover last year, and now the paperback is out. And actually, I'm going to hold the paperback up to the screen because it's such a great package. And I love this book. And it is a campus satire. It is a satire of where we are as a country. It is so many things happening. It is also very laugh out loud funny. And if you've read Vladimir by Julia May Jonas, you have a little bit of an idea of what's happening in The Laughter. Sonora, thank you so much for joining us on the show.
Thank you for having me. This is terrific. I'm very excited to talk to you.
So, The Laughter. Maybe we start with the title. Maybe we do just start with the title, because you and I have agreed we are so spoiler free in this conversation, and we are going to be dancing around stuff, but it's going to be fun.
Yeah, let's start with the title. I think it's pretty relevant because, it's about the laughter of a woman and all the different responses we have to the laughter of women. And that seems to be in topic right now, with the Vice President Kamala Harris running for president, and how people don't like her laughter. They didn't like Hillary's laughter. And actually, I was writing this book in 2016 and was thinking a lot about this. I mean, it just catches me by surprise, and also not, this response to women's voices, their laughter, every aspect, right? So the title has a little bit to do with that. There's an epigraph at the start by Fehmi Daryaz, who's a Pakistani poet, and she talks about the laughter of women and how you'll never understand it and you can never buy it, and sort of like an FU to the thing about, like, I'm going to laugh the way I want. So there's also the theme of, who gets to be the purveyor of humor and laughter, right? So Oliver Harding, who's the protagonist or the antagonist of the book, the narrator of the book, is telling us about this incident, and he basically likes to make people laugh, and he thinks he has a great sense of humor. And I also wanted to play on that, the fact that he thinks that he's the funny one, and also, the fact that people think women can't be funny. So all of those things.
And the thing about Oliver is he is a really unreliable narrator. And I love an unreliable narrator. I really did. They're so much fun, even when they don't know that they're being fun. And Oliver is not the most self-aware character I've met on the page, but he's very earnest. Oh man, he is so earnest. He is so earnest. He's also a G.K. Chesterton scholar, which I thought was an excellent touch.
Me too.
But I'm wondering for you, I mean, we have three main characters. We've got Oliver, we've got Ruhaba, and Ruhaba's nephew, Adel, who's 15, and he's here from France, in the States, in the Pacific Northwest from France. So it's basically the three main characters. But how did you know when you had Oliver's voice? Because it's a tricky voice to pull off. It could have gone pear-shaped, whether that had been the plan or not, but it's a really good, sticky, untrustworthy voice.
Well, thank you for implying that it didn't go pear-shaped. It's like a series of things happened for me to land on Oliver's voice.
Mm-hmm.
I was planning to write it in the three voices, right? The three main characters that you mentioned, and I just kept writing in the three different voices with the events that were happening in their lives from their points of view. But I would look back at the page the next day, and every time I would look at it, I would see that it was written in Oliver's voice, and I'd be like, "What on earth? What's going on here? Why am I going on writing in his voice?" And that's when I realized that the story needs to be told from his point of view and in his voice, and that voice was coming so easily to me. It was really eerie, like he was sitting in my head and dictating to me, and it sort of started to terrify me a little bit, because I felt like I was losing the whole story in many ways. Like, one, I was afraid that I wouldn't be able to sustain that voice, and then also, like, why does he get to tell the story? I want to tell the story, and I'm most aligned, say, with Ruhaba, right? But I think there were all these multiple things going on. As growing up in India, the white male voice is something that we were told was the dominant canonical voice of literature and high literature and high literary craft, right? So there was that, and then there was also this sense of the voices I've heard around me. So it's a campus novel. And a lot of the white male voices around me found their way into the story and into his voice. So that's when I decided I would just get out of his way and let him tell the story, and then have the reins, like, sort of, like a puppet who's like letting the puppet move, but is also the one, that knows what's happening in the story, while Oliver, as you said, is not self-aware, so I know what's going on, but I get to sort of do this thing from under his skin.
I mean, he's actually a little hapless I mean, he has some moments where you're just like, oh my guy, how do you even get out of the house in the morning? He's not malicious, but occasionally there were some lines where it was like, I know how that sounds in your head, Oliver. That's not how it sounds when you say it out loud. Mm-hmm. And he really is trying to maneuver in a world that it's not just that the world has changed around him. He's not interested in the fact that the world has changed. He actually believes that G.K. Chesterton should be a model for life in the 21st century, which Chesterton has his place. I mean, I if you are a Chesterton fan, congratulations. But at the same time, I mean, you have all of these little details in there about this guy, and I'm like, oh, yeah. Mm-hmm. Oh, he is. But again, not a little bewildered that his ex-wife and his daughter are not interested in having a relationship with him. A little bewildered that women don't quite respond to him the way he thinks he should. He really thinks he's quite not a Lothario, but he thinks he's very special and should be, a prize for women. And they're kind of like, thanks, no? What?
I mean, it's so great to have that lack of self-doubt, right?
Right.
It's so great.
But you're a professor of journalism, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So you've got to switch gears, though, completely. I mean, you were moving completely out of fact-based environment. Obviously, there are rules for writing journalism. And yeah, there are rules for writing fiction, but the content is a little more free-form, obviously, when you're writing fiction. Can we talk about that shift, though? When did you start writing this novel, and when did you start thinking fiction was the only way you could actually tell this story?
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting because I first get interested in certain stories as a journalist. So the story of the hijab, the burkini bans in France in 2016, that's what actually got me started on this whole thing, because I was following that and I was just getting really angry, and I kept reading, and I was like, clearly I'm not going to do a news story, or, a news feature on this. I mean, this is not my story. I'm not a journalist in France, right? What is happening here? Why am I getting so obsessed with this? And then I felt like, I could try and approach this with fiction. And so I applied to go, and I thought I would take it as a sign if I got this residency that I applied to in France. And I got in, and I was like, here we go. And so I actually went and I interviewed a whole lot of French Muslim families. Mm-hmm. And because that's where I start as a journalist. I mean, I just cannot write anything without doing a bunch of interviews, even like something that should just come out of my head, right? But it really serves a purpose, because I was able to then stumble upon this story of, this interview with a Pakistani woman who really, talked a lot about things that shaped the way Ruhaba and Adil are represented in the story. And sort of being on the outside of the outside in France and Islamophobia. And so really, getting deep into that research as an academic, and then doing the interviews, and then setting it aside, just sort of like unlearning some of the things, or at least like turning the dial down on some of the, like, okay, you have to stick to the facts, like, and yet I do feel like I peppered the story enough with those facts, but then allow myself to write out of thin air, And that, I love that about fiction. Now I'm only writing fiction, by the way. I just feel like I've converted. Don't tell my employers. But but I do also feel like with young people, with students these days, they don't see these binaries. They don't see these boundaries between, I mean, I'm not saying fact and fiction. They really, I mean, I wouldn't ever tell a journalism student, don't care about the facts. But I think in terms of storytelling and in terms of platforms and in terms of form, I don't think that they are as straitjacketed or constricted as we were and I was as a journalist. So I love writing fiction now. I mean, it's what I'm doing.
But also, I mean, if you look at the rise of, say, memoir or autofiction or whatnot, I mean, we do have ways to play with emotional truth. I mean, facts are still facts, but emotional truth, I mean, that's part of the joy of reading a novel, is that you get to sit in a world. I mean, honestly, if I were seated next to Oliver at a dinner, I would be checking my watch and thinking, when can we leave? I can make small talk with the best of them, too. But there are certain people where you're like, mm-hmm.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And we meet these men there in our meetings, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But when I realized that Adil was Ruhaba's nephew from France. I was like, oh, okay. I really like this. Because, I mean, yes, are they Pakistani by origin? Sure. But the kid is French. He has been raised in French. His first language is French. His culture is French. Yes, his parents are trying to keep him attached to Pakistani culture in a way. And it happens in immigrant families, right? Your family is disrupted, displaced, sent elsewhere. And of course, you're going to have some way of maintaining a connection to what came before, right? You're homesick, you're whatever. But this kid is very, very French. And Oliver keeps missing the fact that this kid is very, very French. And I love that tension.
I mean, this is exactly, thanks for raising that, because that's exactly what I want to do with anything that I write, is like complicate things, right? That say that it's not like Trump saying recently, is she Indian? Is she Black? About Kamala Harris. It's going to keep coming in, because I was writing this in 2016 and his voice was very much in my head. We all live in these complex times. Like we have been living in these complex times. Now it's out there in public life, and people are running for office. And, so to try and bring something down to one nationality and one race and, all of that is just ridiculous. And so I wanted Oliver to feel a little unsteadied by that, how can I take this kid to be French when clearly he's Pakistani? So he says a few things where the kid sort of keeps correcting him and saying, you mean France? You mean this? I like the unsteadying of narratives.
And Adil does have polio. He has a gait that is not your average gait. And at one point, Oliver takes him hiking. He's like, no, it's a very easy hike. And then 2 sentences later, he's like, and then I put crampons in my bag. And I'm sorry, I hear crampons and I think someone's about to, summit Mount Rainier or, Everest or something. I'm like, you need those when there's ice. Like, that's not just a walk on a hill. Oliver, I'm just using that as an example because Oliver really is a little out there. Not the most ill-intentioned guy, but really, he's not participating in the world around him. He's participating in the world as he wishes it would be. I think this is the best way to describe him. And, again, not malicious, but wow, is this dude clueless. He's really genuinely clueless. But how much fun did you have, though, writing a 16-year-old boy? Or 50, excuse me, he's 15.
15, yeah. I loved that. So I have a son, and I think a lot about masculinity. I've written, on that, and I researched that. And so I think there's that particular age, 14 and 15, where they are getting sort of conscripted into a certain kind of masculinity. They could have the influence of people like Oliver in their lives, where it's like, come on, you got to toughen up, like be a man. You can be a man now. There's this whole pressure on them. And there's such a tenderness still to them. And so I like writing about that age. And I definitely, my son was a little bit of a model for that, from when he was that old. But also, it's inquiring into, boyhood and masculinity and at the cusp of adulthood was very important for me. And I really enjoyed writing him. I would say I'm most aligned with Adil as a character. Like, there's a normalcy to him, This was another conversation I was having with my son where I said, like, what did you think of Adil? And he said, he's normal. It's not like he's a good kid or, that he is innocent or anything. That's how we should be. Like, he's just like he just wants to ask Camille out to a movie. He just wants to go back home, and he doesn't understand these motivations of these people around him, the adults around him. So I think that was just like to insert a sense of normalcy where people are so caught up in their own worlds and, things are going to hell in a handbasket.
He just wants to be happy. This is the equivalent of, I want to eat a popsicle. I want to go to a movie. I want to meet another kid. He's walking Oliver's dog, and Edgar and Adil get along quite well. He really is just a very sweet, imperfect, alive character. I'm fond of him, but I have to say Ruhaba, I may be a little biased. I like her. I like her spirit. I like her I mean, the things she says, I'm just like, oh, hi. She's terrific. She's a really, really great character. But I also do feel like we get more of the men and boys' voices, right? Like we hear much more of Oliver and Adil. And it's partially because of the time they spend together, right? And all of the sort of antics they get up to. But I couldn't help but think of Lolita as I was reading The Laughter because, you know, we never really hear from Lolita. We hear from Humbert endlessly and incessantly. And yeah, I'm just wondering how much of that was in the back of your brain as you were writing Ruhaba specifically, because it felt like a choice to me. It felt like a really deliberate choice.
Oh, it absolutely was. You know, and I had to dig my heels in about that because I got a lot of feedback saying, oh, I really want to hear from her. And I was like, the point of I could easily write from her point of view because, yes, she is most like me, even though I identify with Adil's spirit. I do identify with a lot of Ruhaba as well, of course, but that would be the easy choice for me to write the whole thing from, and easy even in terms of marketability. So I was getting a lot of pushback from agents and editors later. Not my editor, thank goodness. He was.
But we love Rakesh. We love him.
We love Rakesh, absolutely. But I think it was definitely a choice because what I want to show is the erasure and the confusion or the wanting to flatten a certain person's point of view or their persona, right? Like understand women only at a certain level. Mm-hmm. And I wanted the reader to feel the discomfort of what they're not hearing. And that is Ruhaba's voice. And even though we hear a little bit of her from emails, those are also negotiated in the voice of Oliver, right? We know we're getting something, but what exactly is this about? So that was really important to me to sort of represent the silencing.
Well, and the filter, right? I mean, this is something I think about a lot, having studied history as my major in college. Who gets to tell the stories, right? Like, who is filtering these? If you think about this, and this popped at dinner the other night, but like, there's an entire generation of Japan and China scholars that are white men of a certain age from a certain school. And, you know, and literally called the chrysanthemum generation for Japan scholars of a certain era. And when I think about how I was taught Asian history, right, and whose voice was telling me what mattered and how, it's a really simple thing, right? Like, we have facts, and yes, there are actual facts and timelines, but then how you tell the story about those facts really matters. And, you know, I am making a little bit of light of Oliver because he does, I mean, again, not intentionally malicious, but man, some of the things that came out of his mouth. There were a couple of moments where I had to sort of step back for a second. I mean, I do like to read in one sitting when I can, and certainly The Laughter is designed for that. But there were a couple of moments where I had to just sort of say, okay, guy, I'm going to give it a minute and sit, because I see how you're processing. Mm-hmm. And, you know, what's that old line? Comedy is tragedy plus time. Mm-hmm. There's a lot underscoring what's happening here. So can we talk about the structure of the novel for a second, and how, yeah, you've talked about how you had to settle on Oliver's voice, and I totally get it. Mm-hmm. I totally get it. But you do some things with time, you do some things with email and text messages, and I mean, you're playing around and sort of challenging the novelist's form.
Am I? So I have to say,
you are. You totally are.
I mean, I haven't studied, you know, I don't have an MFA. I haven't, you know, the only English classes I took were back in like 10th grade. So I really don't know as much about writing and form. I think it's on instinct, and of course by, you know, reading a lot, which I really enjoy. Not as much as you, Miwa. I know you read a lot. So
I do. I've been doing this for a minute.
Yeah. It's so great. I'm very distracted by television. I watch a lot of television. But I do think I think writing the unreliable narrator, once I knew that this is going to be an unreliable narrator, I read everything I could on that and realized where I wanted to create a certain tension. I also wanted to keep myself engaged, right? So I wanted to surprise myself, and writers talk about that too. And I felt like, not, I was writing scenes back and forth. So one of the first scenes I wrote was the penultimate scene where we've learned the thing that has happened. And then, surprised by that, I had to sort of work backwards from that. And so I think in that thing of like scenes appearing, and I was writing them down and then seeing where they fit in, and how would Oliver want to deliver this story. Right. And so I had to again get out of his way and say, okay, this is how you would tell it. You would say the FBI came in here, then make it all about you, then go off and meet your daughter, and then go off on your hike. And you would not stick with, hey, this thing has happened. It's going to be your story about yourself and how it played out for you. So it's almost like he's writing a memoir, and it's while it's a novel, right? So how would he see himself put upon by these circumstances is how the story had to be told.
He really does believe he's telling the truth.
Oh,
he
yeah.
Absolutely believes he's telling the truth. And as you sort of pull back and we get these sort of bits, there are a couple of sort of flash forwards and flashbacks where I was like, oh, Oliver, my guy, you have no idea. Okay.
One more thing I want to say that I didn't say about the laughter was that when I sign when I sign books, depending on who it is, I write, for our laughter. And I think that's the thing. The response that you are having and the response that I really wanted in the reader was like rolling our eyes, laughing at Oliver, and also feeling sort of validated in the suspicion that we've had about these people who are not self-aware, but that they think that they're really funny, but the joke's really on them. So that's also, for our laughter. The fact that you were laughing at this or feeling these things is very validating and gratifying.
Well, I'm happy to hear that. But I want to talk about influences for a second, because I know, obviously Nabokov and Lolita, and that's a longer, more complicated conversation in some ways, because when you're talking about who is sort of participating, right? Like we're all complicit in the prose. I'm certainly not the first person to say that, but we're complicit in the reading of Lolita and the erasure of this young girl and her terrible experience. But at the same time, like, I think there are other writers that you're pulling from. And I just want to bring them into the conversation as well, because, there's a lot. There is a lot at play in the laughter.
Thank you. Lolita for sure, I would say is a disgrace, about the professor in South Africa and the seduction of the young woman. Yeah, I had to steep myself in a lot of other stories that had these complex characters, but also like, some miserable things have happened, and the gaze on women, so because I, as a cishet woman myself, one of the readers gave me this feedback and said, he needs to think more about sex. And I was like, more? More? And so
but it works.
What I could do.
It works.
And so I had to really steep myself in that kind of gaze, and to do that, I had to read a lot of these. But also beautiful things like Remains of the Day and Julian Barnes's sense of an ending. So a lot of these unreliable first-person narratives. And of course, Zadie Smith on Beauty as a campus novel, and her amazing, wit in her work. Iris Murdoch, The Sea. So I was really enjoying reading these, and sort of even back a little further back as Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca, I think is classic. I read that every few years just to get the sense of the thing is he is an English professor. So I also had to inhabit the head of an English professor and the way he would write these things. A friend of mine was she was reading it and she was saying oh my God, I was so frustrated with him because I was like, bro, you're writing a journal. Why are you writing in this language? And so I wanted to give that, slightly self-important, pompous English professor language. That, if he has to put pen to paper, he is going to write that way. So I wanted to get into that voice as well. So these were all these influences that I thought were just all these books are such masterpieces and so tautly told. I wanted to sort of do something similar.
And they're all voice driven. They're I'm just looking at this list going, this is a really great reading list, like straight up. But they're all of the voices are just a little bit arch and a little bit sort of, I am standing at a podium and I am delivering a speech at you kind of thing. I mean, Remains of the Day, I remember the first time I read that novel and I was like, wait a minute, what? Oh, what? Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay. And, I'd read Ishiguro's two earlier novels, which were both set in Japan, and they are similar. Like, you can see him getting to the point of writing Remains of the Day. Mm. But that one just knocks it. I mean, that's a swing. And that novel still holds up. It is extraordinary what he does. And again, we're complicit. As the reader, we are completely complicit. And certainly it's been a minute since I've read the Kotsuya as well, Disgraced. But same thing. It's like we're part of what's happening. And I was really aware of that, too, as I was reading Laughter. As much fun as I was having with sort of a raised eyebrow. And, there's that scene in the cafe where Oliver's looking at the art behind Ruhaba, and he's like, well, clearly she chose to sit here for a reason. And it's like, well, actually, guys, she probably didn't even notice it. Little things like that. But at the same time, there are conversations happening around all three of the characters. There are conversations that they're participating in with each other, maybe not the entire triangle. There's a moment where everyone's in Ruhaba's car and Oliver has put himself in the back seat so that Adil can pop in after going to the movies. And auntie and nephew are having a conversation and Oliver's not necessarily part of that conversation. And he's kind of taking it personally. And it's just like, well, this is all like, you kind of invited yourself along. This is all, you could have taken a car. Like, why? Mm-hmm. And it's moments like that where you realize what the disconnect is. And yet I couldn't stop reading.
Thank you.
So in terms of surprising yourself, though, right, you're not outlining any of this. Are you literally writing scenes and then stitching them together as you need to? Okay.
In a sense, because like I mentioned that I wrote that ultimate scene, and then the other scene that came to me was was Adil and watching his mother being approached by the police in the park in Toulouse, being asked to take off her hijab. And so I wanted to see like how do these two things, how do they come together, right? And so then imagining a story, and then walking my dog, and then another scene coming to me, and then Ruhaba's character looming up, and then how are they related? So no, there was no outlining. It was definitely just sort of throwing things at the wall and seeing what sticks. And then once a few things fell into place, then I was, and then a lot of it was in the second and the third and the fourth drafts. It connects itself. So it was definitely about surprising myself and saying, who is this? And then letting, once Oliver's voice took over, it was like, okay, whoever they are in his gaze, right? And so I won't be able to tell you more than what he sees, but I want to make you uncomfortable about what you're not seeing. I know Ruhaba has this whole other life, and and that Adil wants so many things, but yeah.
But you've also written a mystery story. I mean, it's absolutely a literary mystery. I mean, there is a thing that happens that obviously you and I are not talking about in this moment, but it's also, the stakes are not the same for the three characters. They're just the stakes are absolutely not the same. But we're also talking about like who gets to define not just laughter, but who gets to define what we're afraid of or how we see the other. And I'm using sort of verbal air quotes as I say the other. I mean, Adil has 9 different forms of other. Ruhaba has 9 different forms of other. Oliver, to a certain extent, is not your average. He is a little old-fashioned. He's a little unpredictable. Yeah, he is out of touch. But I mean, again, he's not necessarily what you might expect. So everyone's kind of an outsider in this case, and we're trying to figure out where we're going. And I'm wondering, when did you figure out? I mean, I know you talk, and I mean, that's an image to come with, but you still had to get there, and it takes a minute. So let's talk about process for a second.
Yeah. So I mentioned the research, that the initial research where I was like, okay, I guess I'm not a French journalist following Islamophobia in France, but I can write this as a novel with these complicated characters coming from different parts of the world and put together. How would they meet? And I guess they're meeting on my campus here, right? Because that's the world I know, and meeting in Seattle, where I also wanted to create Seattle as this character. And these particular people, like Oliver is a very sort of Seattle liberal in many ways. He knows the language, he knows what the right politics are, but he's so not aware that he's not on board with these things, and yet there's enough pockets of people that find his words funny and laugh at his jokes, and also sort of like, congratulate him and sort of encourage his behavior. And so he really is not self-aware because society or the people around him haven't asked him to be. They haven't really held him to these high standards, whereas Ruhaba is going through all kinds of things. So I think that was something that was really important, that research. Then I wanted to research, because I'm not a Muslim woman. I'm not from Pakistan. I'm a Hindu woman from India. So I needed to research hijabi Pakistani women. How would they relate to the hijab? And so, talking to Muslim students, talking to Muslim faculty, Muslim friends, Pakistani friends, sort of getting a sense of that character, reading a lot about young men's masculinity, so a lot of those things, which was exciting. And it's also a great way to waste time, right? Just like read a bunch of things and keep saying, I'm researching, I shouldn't be bothered right now. But really, getting to that, and then each thing then revealing something, like Ruhaba's decision to wear the hijab, right? Some of the things with Adil as well, just like discovering things and saying like, okay, then how do I bring this to fiction and make it feel real on the page without feeling heavy and weighed down by the research. And then after a while, like in this, once all of that is done, really, I would say the book came together in, say, the third draft, where I was just like, I'm only in Oliver's voice, and like, I'm going to take out all this other stuff that I feel like I want to say about Ruhaba and Adil, but Oliver wouldn't say,
I do love the relationship between Ruhaba and Adil too, because, she's single. She is not particularly interested in having children. Her family has been saying, why are you not married yet? All of these kinds of things. And she slowly kind of comes to realize that she quite likes this kid. She's like, what do I do with this kid? We don't even know how long he's going to be here, etc. And watching that relationship develop is really kind of charming, because, I mean, not everyone is immediately, bonded to tiny people.
Absolutely. And I wanted to create this sort of complex woman, right, that also sort of explored this myth of the demure brown Pakistani hijabi woman as being sort of like maternal and, having family values and everything. So, and not wanting children, not wanting a relationship necessarily, or, a straightforward relationship. Sort of creating this character that's a little bit, enigmatic and not flat. She's not just, we're only getting a sexualized image of her from his point of view. And then that once that sexualized image starts to sort of blur a little bit or shift a little bit in his world, he keeps returning to it, but almost as if by accident he's revealing other things about her. So yeah, those are the places where I had fun with Oliver, telling more about Ruhaba. And also this was written just on when Trump was elected, right? I started writing it in November 2016. With his voice and his world and the Muslim ban and, all of this happening around. And so that became an important choice to stick with, even as time passed. I just felt like, who were we in that moment? how did we understand that world? And I think for the reader to revisit that time and look at what we thought about the world at that time also was important for me to do, like just in terms of giving a sense of, hey, this was coming all along, and especially with Islamophobia,
I mean, isn't that what art is supposed to do? Isn't it supposed to show us different ways of looking at who we are and sort of where we've been and maybe where we could go? I mean, I do think that all art has a purpose.
Yeah.
And if it can connect us to people, right? I mean, Oliver is Oliver, and I stuck with him. I stuck with him because I wanted to see where it was going, and I wanted to see what kind of story he was going to tell me.
And the reason we want to stick with them, right? Because as he also says, like, I was invited to something, is that we want, like, you're useful, you're also sweet, and you've taken my nephew under your wing, and you're taking him hiking, and you're spending time with him and engage with him. I like that, So Ruhaba is like placing a lot of trust in him because we can. And so they invited to our friendship, into our lives, into our humor even, of course. But sometimes, yeah, you can sit in the back seat and be quiet while I talk to my own people, and we belong here. And, you can take a back seat and listen and learn. So that's the part that he just hasn't learned to do and is not ready. And I think, I was trying to do this thing about America, like, America's not feeling ready enough to just kind of get with it, But there's a lot of fun to be had if you would only just like come on board,
Have you started writing the next novel?
I have. I just finished the first draft, a really, really bad first draft of the next novel.
Okay, but isn't that what you're supposed to do? Just get the terrible draft out, and then you can start picking away and chipping away and getting at the thing that you actually want?
Yeah, absolutely. It was just like, oh my goodness, I'm waiting for who I will be when I write the fourth draft, right?
Well, I know I've had writers describe it to me as barfing out a draft, and I'm like, yep, sounds about right. I mean, you just have to get this sort of the spine of the thing, right? And then you can figure out, because it seems to me that, and you've said it here, 4 drafts, that the writing really comes in the rewriting.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
One of the things, and I mentioned this a little earlier, like, I love the fact that Adil is this kid from France, right? Like, yeah, he happens to be Pakistani, but he's a French kid. And I really do see Ruhaba as an American, right? She's an American. Everything about her is American, and her course of what she teaches, how she lives, how she interacts with the world. I mean, but you are, in a sense, still writing about immigrant communities, and you're doing it in a way, like, you're making me think actually of Dinam Mengistu's Someone Like Us, which is another very surprising sort of take on immigrant communities. And he does some stylistic things in that novel. It is gorgeous. But I hope we start to see more of this broadening. And that, again, that feels really intentional on your part. Because, I think of you as an American too.
Thank you. My son says I'm more American than he is. And it's never a compliment. It's so interesting. When I go back to India and people say, oh, you've become so American, I feel like, this is not a compliment. Be careful, But yes, Ruhaba, we learned from some of her emails and things that she came to the US later and to study, right? So she came here to do a law degree, and she's a law professor. And I really wanted to show the complexity of these lives, that we are not, because I also, as, a twice divorced single parent, am not living what people think of the traditional Indian immigrant life. And my kid isn't either. And so I wanted to show those complexities, that yes, there are all these other immigrant narratives, and we need each kind, but we also need to show the not so great characters of people that are getting in trouble and are sort of pushing against societal norms or expectations, and doing these things that are multi-layered and sort of, they're leading these lives on the fringes even, and doing dangerous things that are not dangerous in the classic way. But I also feel like you're not completely, one of us or not the other, unless you are the curmudgeon of the neighborhood, maybe. Like you're the person who screams at kids and you're a person of color. Like, ooh, what? So I'm like, I could be walking down the street sometime and I feel like I have to nod and smile at every white person so that I feel like they know that I am one of them or I'm not a threat. I have to be so pleasant all the time. And I want to mess with that, at least in fiction. I've started messing with it in real life, but definitely in fiction, I wanted to be like, no, Ruhaba is enigmatic and she's also a little bit off, your expectations, and she's going to do certain things. So you don't get to have her as the demure, nice, person for whom you're fighting and for whose rights you're out there and who, you're going to go into Afghanistan and rescue her from other brown men. I wanted to sort of mess with that a little bit. And yes, I'm so glad that there are all these new narratives. I did listen to your interview with him, and I just felt like, yes, let's put immigrant people in different parts of the world. I think his book is also set in France, right? And let's pull them from all over and mess with a certain gaze, right? But the exciting thing that's happening is like, look at the readership, right? The readership is changing. We are not, I don't know, I mean, you know better about this, but I don't think we're only speaking to a certain kind of reader. The readers are more complex and they want these complex stories.
I think hanging out with Oliver and Ruhaba and Adil was pretty great. A lot happens in the laughter, but I am really, really glad that I got to meet these characters. And I'm really glad you and I got to hang out. So, Sonora, thank you so much. The Laughter is out now in paperback.
Thank you so much, Miwa. This was wonderful.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.